Security told him 3 times to step back. He didn't move. Then the German shepherd broke formation in front of 200 people, walked straight past his handler, and sat down at the homeless man's feet like he was reporting for duty. Nobody in that crowd understood what they were watching. But the dog did. The dog had been waiting 11 years for this exact moment. The town square in Millers Creek, Ohio, was dressed for Memorial Day. Red, white, and blue bunting wrapped around the gazebo. Folding chairs sat in neat rows on the grass. A local brass band tuned quietly near the flagpole, and somewhere behind the crowd, a food truck was already selling out of lemonade. At the center of it all stood a small stage, built for one purpose. Today, the Millers Creek Police Department was retiring its longest-serving K9, a German shepherd named Bear, after 11 years of service. There would be a plaque, a photograph, a folded flag for the department's wall. It was supposed to be simple. Nobody expected the dog to have other plans. At the edge of the square, past the folding chairs, past the roped-off section for families of fallen officers, stood a man nobody in town had bothered to learn the name of. He wore a canvas coat gone gray with age, boots held together with duct tape, and a beard that hid most of his face. People called him the man by the bridge. Children were told not to stare. Shop owners asked him to move along. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the stage, but he was standing closer than security liked. "Sir, I need you to step back behind the barricade," a young officer said, one hand resting lightly near his belt. "This is a restricted area for the ceremony." The man didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded, the way a man nods when he's used to being told to leave places. He took one step back. Then he looked toward the stage, and something in his face changed. His eyes fixed on the dog, standing at attention beside a uniformed handler, and his hands, cracked and weathered, began to tremble. Nobody noticed that yet. All eyes were on the ceremony. Police Chief Daniel Osgood stepped up to the microphone, straightened his jacket, and cleared his throat. 11 years ago, this department took on a young German shepherd with more energy than any of us knew what to do with, he said, and the crowd chuckled politely. Today, we say thank you to a partner who has kept every one of us a little safer. Beside him, Officer Ryan Matthews held Bear's leash. Bear was the current handler's partner, though anyone who watched closely would notice something odd. The dog wasn't looking at Matthews. He wasn't looking at the chief. His ears were locked forward, his body rigid, his golden eyes fixed somewhere past the stage, past the rows of folding chairs. He was looking at the man in the gray coat. "Bear, heel," Matthews whispered, giving the leash a gentle tug. Bear didn't move. A murmur rippled through the front row. The chief kept talking, unaware. In his career, Bear located 3 missing children, apprehended 11 suspects, and never once Bear let out a single sharp whine. It cut through the microphone feedback like a blade. The crowd went quiet. Matthews knelt beside the dog, confused, whispering commands that weren't landing. Bear's whole body had begun to shake, not with fear, but with something closer to desperate recognition, the way a dog trembles when it hears a voice it hasn't heard in years. Then, before anyone could stop him, Bear lunged forward, snapped the leash clean out of Matthews' hand, and ran. He didn't run toward the food trucks. He didn't run toward the parking lot. He ran in a straight line, past the folding chairs, past the barricade, past 2 stunned security guards, until he reached the man in the gray coat and dropped to a sit directly in front of him. Then Bear lifted his right paw. He held it there, trembling, exactly the way a soldier holds a salute. The entire square went silent. For a moment, the only sound in the square was the flag snapping softly against its pole. Then came the murmurs. Then the phones. Then a child's voice, clear and unfiltered, cutting through the confusion. "Mummy, why is the police dog saluting the homeless man?" Nobody had an answer for her. Not yet. Nobody moved for what felt like a full minute. Officer Matthews stood frozen at the edge of the stage, his hand still curled around empty air where the leash had been. Chief Osgood lowered the microphone slowly, his mouth open, no words coming out. Somewhere in the crowd a phone camera clicked, then another, then a dozen more. The homeless man knelt down slowly, his knees cracking against the pavement, and pressed his forehead gently against Bear's. "Hey, Duke," he whispered. "Hey, boy, not Bear, Duke," a woman in the front row gasped audibly. Did he just call him something else? Matthews finally found his legs and jogged over, his face a mixture of alarm and confusion. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the dog. He's not usually like this." The man looked up. His eyes were red, wet, but steady. "He's not confused, son," he said quietly. "He remembers. Dogs don't forget who trained them to survive a war." Matthews blinked. "Wait, what did you say?" But the man had already gone, still again, one hand resting on Bear's head, the way a person touches something they were sure they'd lost forever. Chief Osgood stepped down off the stage, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel path, and approached with the kind of caution he usually reserved for armed suspects. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask who you are," he said, not unkindly, but firmly. "That dog just broke a command in the middle of an official ceremony." The man didn't answer right away. He looked down at Bear, who hadn't moved from his position, paw still lifted, eyes locked on his face like he was terrified the man might vanish if he blinked. "My name," the man finally said, "is Thomas Halbrook. I used to be a staff sergeant. And that dog you call Bear, I trained him myself in a kennel outside Kandahar, back when his name was Duke, and mine still meant something." A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. Chief Osgood's brow furrowed. "That's not possible," he said slowly. "Bear came to this department from a canine vendor in Columbus 9 years ago. His full service history is on file. Then somebody's file is wrong," Thomas said. His voice cracked, not from anger, but from exhaustion, the kind that builds over years, not minutes. Or somebody made sure it was. Matthews looked down at Bear, who had finally lowered his paw but hadn't left Thomas's side. In 11 years, Matthews had never seen the dog behave this way, not during gunfire drills, not during building searches, not even the day Bear took a knife wound protecting a rookie officer 3 years back. "Chief," Matthews said quietly, "I think we need to hear him out." They moved the conversation away from the stage, into the shade beside the old courthouse steps, though half the town square had already turned their chairs to watch. Bear sat pressed against Thomas's leg the entire time, refusing every attempt to coax him away, even the offer of his favorite tennis ball, which Matthews tried out of pure habit. "Start from the beginning," Chief Osgood said, arms crossed, though his voice had softened. "You said you trained him overseas." Thomas nodded slowly. 2011. I was assigned to a multi-purpose canine unit. Duke was 8 months old when they gave him to me. Skinny thing, scared of loud noises, nobody thought he'd make it through basic training. A faint, tired smile crossed his face. I used to sleep next to his kennel the first few weeks, so he wouldn't panic at night. That's a nice story, Osgood said carefully. But Bear's paperwork says he was bred and trained domestically. There's no overseas record. I didn't say the army trained him, Thomas said. I said I did, off the books, at first, before the program made it official. He paused, his jaw tightening. We did 2 deployments together. He found 4 IEDs that would have killed men I served with. He pulled a corporal out of a collapsed structure by the man's vest strap when I couldn't move fast enough. He saved more lives than most of the medals on that stage represent. Matthews felt something cold settle in his chest. Then why, he asked slowly, does none of that show up anywhere? Thomas's hands curled into fists on his knees. Because of what happened after. The crowd, still watching from a careful distance, leaned in without meaning to. Even the brass band had stopped tuning their instruments. There was an incident, Thomas said. Convoy ambush. I gave an order that got questioned later by a superior officer who wasn't even on the ground that day. Said I hesitated. Said men died because of it. His voice dropped barely above a whisper. They didn't die because of me. They died because our support never arrived. But it was easier to blame the sergeant than the officer who approved a bad extraction route. Osgood's expression shifted, the skepticism slowly draining into something more careful. What happened to you? Quiet discharge, Thomas said. No court-martial, no formal charges. Just enough pressure to make me sign paperwork. I didn't understand agreeing to leave without contesting anything. They told me it was the only way to protect my pension. He laughed, short and bitter. There was no pension. Not really. Just enough to disappear quietly. And Duke? Matthews asked. Thomas's eyes went distant. They told me working dogs stayed with the unit, reassigned. I never got to say goodbye. I spent 6 years trying to track down what happened to him through paperwork requests that kept coming back denied or lost. By the time I stopped looking, I'd lost my apartment, then my truck, then pretty much everything else. Bear, as if he understood every word, pressed his head harder against Thomas's leg. I ended up here 2 years ago, Thomas said. Followed work that never came through. Been sleeping under the Miller's Creek Bridge since. I saw the flyer for today's ceremony pinned outside the diner. Said a canine named Bear was retiring after 11 years of service. His voice broke slightly. 11 years. I did the math before I even saw his face. I told myself it couldn't be him. I told myself I was being an old fool. He looked down at the dog. But he knew me before I even got close enough to see his eyes. Chief Osgood was quiet for a long moment, staring at the dog who had spent over a decade wearing his department's badge without ever once, in all that time, shown this kind of reaction to a stranger. If this is true, Osgood said carefully, there should be records, somewhere, a transfer file, a veterinary history. Something that shows where Bear came from before he reached the vendor in Columbus. There should be, Thomas agreed, but somebody had a reason to make sure there wasn't. A voice cut through the small crowd before Osgood could respond. That's a serious accusation to make in public, Sergeant Halbrook. Everyone turned. A man in a crisp gray suit was walking toward them from the direction of the reserved seating, flanked by 2 others in similar attire. He had the kind of practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes, and a small American flag pin fastened neatly to his lapel. Thomas went rigid the moment he saw him. Bear's low growl started before Thomas even spoke a word. Colonel Grayson, Thomas said, his voice suddenly hollow. Retired colonel now, the man corrected smoothly, extending a hand nobody took. It's been a long time, Halbrook. I almost didn't recognize you. His eyes flicked briefly, dismissively, over Thomas's worn coat. Life's clearly been difficult. You're here for the ceremony? Osgood asked, glancing between the 2 men, sensing tension he didn't yet understand. I'm here because I've served on this county's Veterans Advisory Board for the last 4 years, Grayson said pleasantly. I helped coordinate today's retirement event, actually. Small world, isn't it? Thomas's hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't grief. You're the one who signed off on my discharge papers, he said quietly. You're the one who told command I hesitated during the ambush. Grayson's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes went cold. I filed an honest report based on the information available at the time. You weren't there, Thomas said, louder now. You were 40 miles back at command, and you needed someone to blame so your extraction route didn't get questioned by anyone above you. A few people in the crowd had drifted closer, phones lifted, recording without pretending otherwise anymore. This is neither the time nor the place, Grayson said smoothly, though a muscle in his jaw had begun to tighten. Chief Osgood, I'd suggest we continue the ceremony and deal with this man's situation separately. Bear's growl deepened. Osgood held up a hand. Actually, Colonel, I think we're going to need to have a longer conversation. Because if this department has been running a K-9 with falsified service records for 11 years, that's not a small problem. That's a legal one. For the first time, the confident mask on Grayson's face cracked, just slightly. I don't know what you think you're implying, he said. I'm not implying anything yet, Osgood replied evenly. I'm asking questions, and so far, you're the only person here who seems uncomfortable with them. The ceremony didn't continue that afternoon. Instead, folding chairs sat empty while Chief Osgood pulled Officer Matthews aside and quietly asked him to bring every scrap of paperwork the department had on Bear's acquisition back in the records room. Her word spread through the square faster than anyone could control it. By the time the sun started dipping behind the courthouse, half the town had already heard some version of the story, and most of them were wrong. Thomas sat on the courthouse steps, with Bear's head resting heavily in his lap, the dog refusing to move more than a few inches from him, even as officers came and went. Someone had brought Thomas a cup of coffee. He held it with both hands like he was afraid it might disappear. You really trained him overseas, Matthews said, sitting down a respectful distance away, still processing everything he'd heard. 11 years, and I never knew any of this. Wasn't your fault, Thomas said. Wasn't anybody's fault who came after. Whoever built that vendor file did a good job covering the trail. He rubbed a hand slowly along Bear's back. Doesn't surprise me, honestly. Grayson always did know how to make problems disappear on paper. What happened to the men in your unit? Matthews asked carefully. The ones who survived the ambush. Thomas's expression tightened. Some of them wrote letters defending me after the discharge went through. Didn't matter. By the time anyone with authority read them, I was already gone. No forwarding address, no way for the letters to reach me. He let out a slow breath. I imagine most of them believe what they were told. That I hesitated. That men died because of me. Did you? Matthews asked, not unkindly, just needing to hear it directly. Thomas met his eyes. No, he said simply. I gave the order to hold position because the extraction route we were given ran directly through a known ambush corridor. I refused to move my men into it without confirmation. That confirmation came 4 minutes later, and by then it was already too late for the 2 we lost. Grayson approved that route from a command tent 40 miles away without ever checking current intelligence. He paused. It was easier to blame the guy on the ground than the guy who made the call from safety. Bear let out a low, mournful sound, almost a sigh, and pressed closer against him. Thomas closed his eyes. And for a moment, he wasn't sitting on cold courthouse concrete anymore. He was back in the dust and the heat, radio static crackling in his ear. Duke straining against his lead with his nose pointed at a stretch of road that looked, to every untrained eye, completely empty. Hold here, he'd told his men. Duke's alerting. Something's wrong with this stretch, Cannon had pushed back immediately. The extraction window was closing. Grayson's voice had come through, clipped and irritated, 40 miles away in an air-conditioned command tent, telling him to move now. They didn't have time for a dog's nerves. Thomas had held anyway. 4 minutes. It had felt like 4 hours. When the confirmation finally came through, It came too late for the 2 men already dead. But it came in time for the 14 who were still breathing, still standing behind him, waiting on his word instead of Grayson's order. He'd told himself for years that if he'd moved when Grayson wanted, more would have died, not fewer. He believed it. He had to believe it, because the alternative was that he'd spent a decade homeless for making the right call. Nobody had ever told him he was right. Not officially. Not until now. Matthews sat with that for a long moment. "We're going to need proof," he finally said. "Not because I don't believe you. Because Grayson's not going to admit anything without it." Thomas nodded slowly. "There's a man who might still have it. Corporal Ellis Ruiz. The one Duke pulled out of that collapsed building. He kept a personal log the whole deployment, wrote everything down, said it kept him sane." His eyes flickered with something close to hope. "If anyone knows where to find him, he'd back up every word." "Do you know where he is now?" Matthews asked. Thomas shook his head. "Lost touch, same as everyone else. But he's out there somewhere. He owes Duke his life. Men like that don't forget." That night, Matthews drove Thomas back to the underpass by Miller's Creek, the closest thing Thomas had to an address. He offered him a ride to a shelter instead, but Thomas shook his head. "I've slept here 2 years, he said quietly, unrolling a thin sleeping bag against the concrete. "One good day doesn't change where I lay my head tonight, not until this is settled properly." Matthews didn't argue. He just sat down on the curb beside him, the way you sit with someone when words won't help much. Somewhere above them, the highway hummed with late traffic. "You really think Grayson's going to let this go quietly?" Matthews asked. "No," Thomas said. "Man like that doesn't survive 25 years in uniform by letting things go. He'll come at this from an angle we're not expecting." He was right. 2 days later, a story appeared in the county paper, quoting an anonymous former colleague who suggested Sergeant Thomas Halbrook had a documented history of mental instability following his deployment, and maybe, in the writer's careful phrasing, misremembering events for reasons of his own. No name was attached, no source was verified. But by the time Osgood read it over his morning coffee, half the department had already seen it. "It's not evidence," Osgood told Matthews grimly, folding the paper shut. "But it doesn't need to be. It just needs to make people doubt him long enough for the paperwork to quietly disappear again." Matthews felt his jaw tighten. "Then we need Ruiz here faster than 4 days." Meanwhile, Thomas sat under the bridge with Bear's head resting heavy across his lap, unaware yet of the article, watching the water move slow and dark beneath the highway. "I keep waiting to wake up," he admitted quietly, more to the dog than to himself. "Feels like the kind of thing that isn't allowed to stay true." Bear only pressed closer, the way he always had whenever Thomas's voice went somewhere far away. It took 4 days to find Ellis Ruiz. He was living 2 states away, running a small auto repair shop outside Louisville, a wife and 2 kids at home, a life that looked nothing like the desert compound where he'd once been trapped under 3 feet of collapsed concrete. When Officer Matthews called him, expecting hesitation, expecting reluctance to reopen old wounds, Ruiz answered almost before the second ring finished. "Sergeant Halbrook," he said, before Matthews had even explained why he was calling. "You found him. He's alive." Matthews sat up straighter. "You knew his name before I said it." "I've been trying to find that man for 6 years," Ruiz said, his voice tight. "Every request I filed got denied. Every letter got returned. I figured the army buried him on purpose." "You knew about the discharge?" "I knew it was wrong," Ruiz said flatly. "I was there." Halbrook didn't hesitate. He made the only call that could have saved more of us. If we'd pushed through that corridor when they wanted us to, we'd have lost the whole convoy, not 2 men. His voice cracked slightly. I've carried that guilt for years, watching a good man get erased, while the officer who nearly got us all killed collected another promotion. Would you be willing to put that in writing? Matthews asked. Officially, with your name on it. There was a pause on the line, brief but heavy. I'll do better than that, Ruiz said. I'll drive up myself. The following Saturday, the town square filled again, though this time nobody had organized a formal ceremony. Word had simply spread, the way it does in small towns, that something important was about to happen at the courthouse steps, and people came anyway, folding chairs in hand, coffee cups steaming in the morning air. Ellis Ruiz stood beside Thomas on the courthouse steps, a manila folder held tightly in one hand, his other resting briefly on Bear's head as the dog sniffed him with quiet recognition, tail giving one slow, uncertain wag. He remembers you, Thomas said softly. Dogs don't forget who saved their life either, Ruiz said, his voice thick. Chief Osgood stood a few steps below them, along with the mayor, a county records officer, and notably Colonel Grayson, who had been asked, formally and firmly, to attend. Ruiz opened the folder. This is my personal deployment log, he said, loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear. Every page dated, every entry witnessed by at least one other soldier, who's since confirmed the same events independently. It documents the ambush, the extraction route ordered by Colonel Grayson's command, and Staff Sergeant Halbrook's refusal to move without updated intelligence. He paused, looking directly at Grayson. It also documents the 4 minutes we waited before confirmation came through, and the moment the ambush hit anyway, 40 miles from where you were sitting. Grayson's face had gone pale, his earlier composure nowhere in sight. This is a private personnel matter, he said stiffly. It doesn't belong in a public square. It stopped being private, Chief Osgood said evenly. The moment a falsified K-9 service record ended up on my department's payroll for 11 years. A county records officer stepped forward, holding a thin stack of papers. We pulled the original transfer documentation, she said. It was filed under a different name and date than what appears in Bear's official file. Someone altered his intake paperwork before he ever reached the vendor in Columbus. All eyes turned toward Grayson. I had nothing to do with that, he said quickly, though his voice had lost its earlier smoothness. Then you won't mind, Osgood said, if we ask the vendor who originally supplied his paperwork 9 years ago. Grayson said nothing. Thomas stepped forward, his voice steady for the first time in years. I'm not here for revenge, he said, loud enough for the whole square to hear. I'm here because that dog never stopped believing I was worth waiting for, even after everyone else decided I wasn't. I'm here because 2 families lost sons in that ambush, and they deserve to know the truth wasn't what they were told. He looked directly at Grayson. And I'm here because Duke deserves to retire with the record he actually earned. The square was silent except for the soft rustle of the flag overhead. Bear sat perfectly still beside Thomas, watching Grayson with the same unwavering focus he'd once used to track threats across a war zone. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected once it became public. Within 2 weeks, the county records office confirmed that Bear's original intake paperwork had indeed been altered, his true service origin scrubbed and replaced with a fabricated domestic training history. The vendor in Columbus, when questioned, admitted he'd simply processed documents that were handed to him already completed, never questioning why a dog with visible shrapnel scarring along one hind leg had no combat history listed anywhere. Colonel Grayson resigned quietly from the County Veterans Advisory Board before the State Review Board could formally request his testimony. No criminal charges were filed, the incident too old, the paper trail too deliberately obscured for prosecution. But his name was formally removed from 2 military commendations tied to the deployment, and a review was opened into the original ambush report, based on Ruiz's log and 2 additional statements from surviving soldiers who came forward once they learned Thomas had resurfaced. For Thomas, the outcome that mattered most had nothing to do with Grayson at all. 6 weeks after the ceremony that never finished, the town square filled once more, this time with folding chairs that had been set up properly, a podium with a working microphone, and a plaque that had been quietly remade. Chief Osgood stood at the front, Bear seated calmly beside him, though his eyes kept drifting toward the small crowd until they found Thomas standing near the front row, wearing a donated but clean jacket, his beard trimmed, his eyes clear. 11 years ago, Osgood began, this department believed it was retiring a dog named Bear, trained through a domestic program with an admirable but incomplete record of service. He paused. Today, we're correcting that record. He gestured for Thomas to step forward. This is Duke, Osgood said, trained in a war zone by a soldier who refused to send his men into a known ambush, no matter what it cost him personally. Duke served 2 combat deployments, located 4 explosive devices, and saved the life of the man standing beside him today. He nodded toward Ruiz, who stood quietly near the steps. For 11 years, this town knew half of his story. Today, we know all of it. He held out a small velvet box. Inside sat a service commendation, newly issued, bearing Duke's original military designation, alongside a formal letter reinstating Thomas Halbrook's discharge status to honorable, with full benefits retroactively restored. Thomas's hands shook as he opened it. For a long moment, he couldn't speak at all. Bear rose slowly from his seated position beside Osgood, walked the short distance across the stage, and sat down in front of Thomas exactly the way he had 6 weeks earlier. Then he lifted his paw again. This time, the whole square rose to their feet in silence. No applause, just the quiet, steady sound of 200 people standing together for a moment that didn't need words. Thomas knelt down, resting his forehead against the dog's one final time. "Good boy," he whispered. "You brought me home." An elderly woman near the front, a Gold Star mother whose son had never made it home from a different war, pressed a tissue to her eyes and said nothing at all. She didn't need to. Around her, the same quiet understanding passed her through the crowd like a current, the kind of grief and gratitude that doesn't need a microphone to be heard. Ruiz stepped down from the stage and wrapped Thomas in a hug that lasted longer than either man probably intended, both of them holding on the way soldiers do when words run out. "Told you I'd find you," Ruiz said, his voice thick. "Took you long enough," Thomas answered, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he laughed. A week after the ceremony, a letter arrived at the police station addressed simply to the family of Sergeant Thomas Halbrook. Inside was a photograph, worn soft at the corners, of a young private who died in the same ambush years before, along with a note from his mother in Ohio, who had read about the case in the county paper. "I always believed my son died because a sergeant panicked," she wrote. "I carried that anger for 11 years. I am ashamed of how I carried it. Thank you for telling the truth, even this late. My son would want you to know he trusted you completely." He wrote that in his last letter home, though I never understood what he meant until now, Thomas read it twice on the courthouse steps. Bear's head resting against his knee, and then folded it carefully and placed it inside his jacket, next to the small commendation box he now carried everywhere. "She didn't have to write that," Matthews said quietly. "No," Thomas agreed, "but some people carry the truth even when it costs them something to say it out loud. That's the part folks forget about honor, It isn't just following orders. It's telling the truth after everyone else has stopped listening. 6 months later, Thomas Halbrook has an apartment 2 blocks from the town square, a part-time job at the local hardware store, and a standing invitation to Sunday dinner with Ryan Matthews's family. Bear, now formally retired with full honors, spends his days exactly where he always seemed to want to be, curled up at Thomas's feet, occasionally lifting his head whenever the front door opens, just to make sure it's really him. Ellis Ruiz still calls every few weeks, sometimes just to talk. Sometimes just to hear Thomas's voice on the other end of the line, proof that some things, once lost, can still find their way back. Miller's Creek never got a big parade or a national headline. Just a small square, a corrected record, and a dog who refused to let a good man stay forgotten. Have you ever known someone whose sacrifice went unrecognized for far too long? Tell us about them in the comments below. If this story reminded you that loyalty never truly fades, consider leaving a like so more people can discover stories like this one. Share this with someone who believes veterans, and the dogs who served beside them, deserve to be remembered. We believe every forgotten hero has a story worth telling. If that mission matters to you, we'd be honored to have you with us here at K9 Heroes Uncovered.